This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. This episode is brought to you by the team at the Real Soil Company. Launched to the market in 2020, the Real Soil Company proudly offers new organic, peat-free super soil. Packed full of organic nutrients for optimal plant health, super soil's natural boosters will stimulate quicker plant establishment and better resilience against pests and disease, whilst also enabling edible crops to benefit from nutritional enhancement and a higher crop yield. The enhanced soil also offers better water retention and release for optimum plant growth, whilst providing a more balanced and workable material for gardeners. As a special offer for listeners, the Real Soil Company is offering 5% off all orders of its new super soil throughout May and June 2021. Simply visit the link in the show notes and enter the code ROOTSANDALL5, all uppercase, at the checkout. In this episode, I'm interviewing Gina Buenfeld-Murley, exhibitions curator of the Camden Art Centre and co-curator of the online exhibition, The Botanical Mind. In this episode, we go deep into the relation between art and the natural world and talk about sacred geometry, indigenous art, symbolism, Jung, the mysterious Voynich manuscript, and why this exhibition is so pertinent given the current relationship humans have to the rest of nature. I began by asking Gina why this exhibition and why now.
So the Botanical Mind, Art Mysticism and the Cosmic Tree is an exhibition which is reflecting on plants and thinking about their significance to human life, culture and spirituality. So it's not an exhibition with artworks that illustrate plants necessarily, although there are some with plant motifs. And in some instances, the cosmic tree, for example, appears. But it's an exhibition really that is focusing on the vantage of plants to the world that we share with them and the ways in which they exert their being, their intelligence, through pattern, through aesthetics, and many different ways of being which differ to our own because they're sessile, so they're rooted to one place. They don't move around, but they nonetheless recruit others to do that work for them, insects and birds to pollinate for them. And so, it was just sort of stepping outside of a human-centric perspective, really, to think again about the world that we're in. And in a sense, it sort of revives an animist principle, I think, appreciating that, all aspects of the living world have a life force and have a being that runs through them. So that's where the idea of mind, the botanical mind, really comes to the fore.
It's obviously now it's available online. How did you adapt it to being online, in light of what we had during the lockdowns?
Yeah, so we were all set to install the show. We'd already started shipping works from around the world. And then the pandemic hit. So we sort of quickly started to think about, when we could open and how to plan for the future. But it just felt that there was rich research that really was underpinning the exhibition, that we wanted to take that onto an online platform. So we put obviously all the artists that are in the show appear in one way or another on the online platform, but it was also an opportunity for us to bring in other voices, other thinkers, writers, and artists actually that hadn't been proposed for the original show, but that we felt were appropriate to put on this online platform. And the response was just incredible. I think it was so enriching to sort of spread out in that way and bring in new voices and expand on the project in a way that we couldn't within the confines of the gallery space that we have. And it reached people all around the world. I mean, we still receive emails from people in Australia or Brazil saying that, they've really appreciated the content there and that it's really resonated with them. So it also allowed us to sort of experiment with new formats as well. So the podcast series was the first time we were sort of exploring that. And it's been extremely successful. So it's something that we're taking forward now into our other programs as well.
Yeah. it is a multimedia exhibition, and that, I suppose, being online, I don't know, there might be something slightly more personal to watching a video online with your headphones in than there would be if you were to sit down and watch a video in a gallery where you're quite easily distracted. So I can see how, in some ways it's lovely in a gallery setting, but it's also, as you say, it's brought a kind of new dimension to the exhibition. And I know we spoke briefly before, but how long will it be available for to view online?
So the online platform, which is botanicalmind.online, we're going to keep that up indefinitely, really, because, as I say, it's just had such a positive response from people. And I think it's a really rich resource for anyone that's interested in these ideas of mysticism or animism or, natural world or plants, as well as, many of the different artistic traditions that are represented in the show, from surrealism to modernism to contemporary art. So keep that there for the foreseeable future.
One of the things that interested me is that you talk about sacred geometry and patterns that you find in nature, but that are also common to entheogenic experiences. And, what the exhibition shed light on for me was the fact that these patterns occur at the micro and the macro level, which is something that I hadn't really thought about before. But, what's the relevance of that, and how do you cover that in the exhibition?
Yeah, so pattern and geometry was really a starting point for my thinking about the ideas in the show and about how plants behave. And when you look at plants, you see an array of, really dazzling geometries and patterns. They take a single motif, like a leaf or a flower, and they repeat it and repeat it. So you really get a sense of these kind of geometrical abstractions, really. They're at once figurative because they represent the plant, but they're also abstract, and what's revealed in them is this mathematical principle that underlies all things in the universe. Actually, we see it perhaps most evidently in plants for the reasons I explained, but that's something which runs right through the manifest world. So sacred geometries, that terminology derives from an idea that these geometries or mathematical principles belie a kind of a greater intelligence, or that sometimes they're referred to as the fingerprint of God. So these things couldn't just be incidental. There's an intelligence or a kind of higher order which is expressing itself through the natural world. And for our ancient ancestors, our philosophical ancestors in ancient Greece, the idea of spirituality or divinity wasn't separated from the study of nature. It was, as we do with science now, we sort of think of science as a purely sort of objective and secular practice, and then religion is split off. But for them, looking at the natural world and the mystery of it was really to study God and to study divinity. So this idea that there's a sort of unifying principle that runs through nature, from the movement of the planets, the arrangement of celestial formations, right down to the subatomic realm, the same patterns are repeated again and again. And this has been contemplated by philosophers, by artists, definitely since antiquity, but, probably even earlier. So there's an idea that's referred to as the music of the spheres, which prevailed from antiquity through till the medieval era, right up until the scientific revolution, that sort of described the universe and the way it behaved in musical terms, which were underpinned by mathematical principles. So those ideas were, really fascinating to me. And the geometries that you mentioned, fractal geometries that, often people report when they're working with psychoactive plant medicines, like ayahuasca, for example, or magic mushrooms, that these are patterns which occur within the mind, but also outwardly in nature. And then, as I say, all through nature. So from the smallest to the largest. So it seems to imply, some kind of order which unites all things, and this idea of sort of self-similarity within the universe. So a fractal is a geometry which kind of replicates through self-similarity. You'll see the same motif which recurs nested within the same motif, but on a larger scale. So within it's a physical pattern, but it's also representing or actually expressing a metaphysical idea of infinity. It's something which appears to come out of nowhere and can keep proliferating and increasing in scale, to infinity. So the ideas that are implicit within these patterns are really profound. They're not in any way superficial or decorative, which I think is the way that people often perceive these things, especially with plants and nature. They're beautiful. But I suppose the exhibition in a way is an invitation to think more deeply about what that beauty is and how it's actually a form of intelligence in nature.
Yeah, that is a perfect intro to my next question, which was, many people perhaps think that art and science are separate, and you do have an essay in the exhibition by Georgio Griffa, which talks about the two being inextricably linked. And I guess that, these logical patterns do get expressed through art, and it might be as literal as kind of copying a pattern. But as you say, it goes much beyond that. How do these patterns influence art? I know that's a massive question, but if you thought about it on a kind of maybe a slightly deeper level, how do you see that being expressed?
Well, I think the universe really speaks in signs and in this kind of visual language, which I sort of just touched upon. And when artists are working, I think they're often sort of conduits for that same logic, sort of channeling an order somehow in and through their work. So I definitely don't think the two things are separate. I think they're quite complementary. And, one of the things which fascinated me to begin with, like the exhibition is really far reaching. Like it goes back through time. It's some of the earliest artifacts are from 500 years ago. And it also looks geographically around the world at different art forms, but that didn't feel, too eclectic or too sort of, it was in no way just coincidental, that these things came together. They came together because they shared something. They shared sort of archetypal forms that were coming through in the artworks of these different cultural traditions. And, I think that's because people all around the world through time have been fascinated by these patterns, the behavior of the natural world. They've been looking around themselves and asking questions about what that means. So if you look at Neolithic stone carvings in Ireland, for example, and compare that to mandalas from Tibet or Islamic mosaics and the patterns that are shown there, or textiles from indigenous peoples in the Amazon, there are motifs which occur and recur again and share these sort of similar qualities. So, I think there's something universal about these patterns because they're what we all share. They're the natural world that we all live in. I think that they have fascinated artists through time, from medieval stained glass windows, the sort of mandala forms that we're very familiar with in sort of Rayon architecture, which, bear great similarity to mandalas in Eastern traditions. And so that was really something that we were exploring and gave ourselves kind of license to do that in the exhibition and on the online platform. And one of the really interesting collaborations that we had through the exhibition was working with Gemma Anderson, an artist who's based in Exeter, who collaborates with scientists. And she's exploring drawing as a process of inquiry. So drawing not just to illustrate scientific ideas, particularly within the botanical tradition, that's really been the relationship between science and art, is that the artist would illustrate the scientist's ideas or findings, but actually sort of turning that around and looking at drawing as a way of exploring and imagining the processes, the life processes of different organisms, plants, animals, cell formations. So sort of using the artistic process as a mode of inquiry, which I think is really relevant to a lot of people now.
It is, and actually, I suppose it kind of answers a question that I had, which was, do these things become unscientific or imperfect when they're kind of reproduced through the medium of the human hand or the human whatever is being used to create the piece of art?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think science in some ways tries to separate that out or to isolate any kind of subjective or human influence on a study. But I think there's also another way of approaching that, which is to think that, we're part of nature. So, what better instrument to explore those inquiries through, really, than our own capacities, our own aversions or attractions to different subjects or different aesthetics. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of rich area there to explore.
Yeah, and I do wonder, again, kind of looking at the exhibition, I think there's a lot more contact and dialogue between humans and the natural world when we look at indigenous art and appreciation of nature, and that is both past and present. And I wondered why, how can we be inspired by that connection and avoid cultural appropriation or slipping into romanticism?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the starting point of the exhibition for me, the thing that really inspired me was the time that I spent in the Amazon and the experiences that I had with different indigenous communities there. And it's not that romantic, really. I think that the ideas that people have of these kind of exotic places that leafy and wonderful are very different to the reality, which is being eaten by mosquitoes and very very sort of challenging physical situations. But the thing that struck me were the artworks and the cultural traditions, the music, and in particular the textile traditions. And the question of cultural appropriation is, obviously really pertinent. But I felt that in this exhibition there was an opportunity to celebrate these works that come from a very different cultural tradition to our own, as a way of kind of stepping out of the very dominant way that we approach material culture coming from the West, in order to come back and look at our relationship to the natural world and to art, actually. I think part of the relevance of this exhibition is that it comes at a time where we're in the middle of a huge environmental crisis that's brought about largely by the behaviors of people in the West. Our idea that, we can extract infinitely from nature what we want, without living in a way that's harmonious with the natural world and thinking about the planet as an entity of its own, that has its own eddies and flows and rhythms and, understanding that everything is connected. And, these are things which are just implicitly part of the way that indigenous peoples live. They live with their land. They live with the plants and animals that they share those environments with. And, that really inspired me, being in those cultures and seeing how they appreciated the notion of spirit being through all things, that plants have spirit, the stars do, the sun, the water, the wind. So, being able to step out of our worldview and experience these alternative cosmologies and then bring that to bear on our own behaviors felt extremely important. The thing that inspired me the most were the artworks, the music, these incredible woven textiles that have the sacred geometries of the different communities woven into them. So, just thinking back to what I was saying earlier about the importance of geometry and these patterns that run through all aspects of the living world. This is really fundamental to a lot of indigenous groups in the Amazon, that they derive patterns from different entities in the rainforest. So whether that's the jiboya, which is the sacred serpent, markings on its skin, or a butterfly, or a particular plant, these geometries are sort of abstracted and then woven into textiles or painted onto their skin or created as beadwork. And, again, these aren't just decorative. When they wear them, it's a bit like wearing an amulet. So they're calling the spiritual energy of that entity to themselves for protection. And when they sing the music, which is also inspired by those entities in the rainforest, again, they're calling that energy in, often to heal, and sometimes using that music in their plant healing ceremonies as well. So using plant medicines in communion with this music, which realigns the energy in the body. So for me, these practices are in no way romanticized. They're in many ways very practical. They're about the way that these people live sustainably with the rainforest, the way that they gain knowledge of life through their senses rather than just with intellect or with scientific study. They're gaining knowledge through music, through singing and chanting and becoming one with this life field that they live with. That for me was really inspiring and really important. And I think, that there's nothing that could be more helpful right now than looking for different ways of living and existing, given that our own is, clearly so unsustainable.
That's really interesting. And I know this is totally off piste, but as you were speaking, it made me wonder if, when we buy things in a consumerist culture, we're buying things that we have no real connection to and that bear no relevance to our lives and don't make sense maybe on an aesthetic level even. I'm thinking about, you might buy some clothing with a pattern on it that means absolutely nothing to you. And I wonder if that's why we keep on throwing things away and buying new things, because we're looking for that connection that we can't establish. I might be completely reading too much into it, but it's a thought.
No, definitely. I mean, yeah, as I said before, a lot of the function of those practices that I just described, they're practical. They're about the way that they live. That you couldn't sort of separate one out from the other. So, I think it's really relevant what you point out. And the other thing to say is that many people have these patterns in their homes, like the Navajo geometries that and now quite ubiquitous, actually. So many people buy them either in IKEA or, wherever, these replicas of traditional Navajo textiles, geometries, which for them are cosmological. They're about the cardinal directions, they're about the sky, the portal to the spirit realm. None of those geometries are just decorative. They represent the way that they see the universe and their place within it. But now so many people in the West just have them, thrown over their sofas with no understanding of what they mean at all. And I think that, that really does illustrate the way that we're just so alienated, really, from the mode of production, this, that underpins our own comfort. Often, we're not sort of connected with the land. We don't have any involvement with harvesting the food or farming or, anything. You just buy it and adopt. So there's a definite kind of schism between those two things, which impoverishes our experience, I think, in the end. That we gain convenience, but we lose something much more important.
Yeah, the disconnect is scary to think about. So I was thinking about the something completely, again, totally different to that, which is in the indecipherability of the, and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, I'm sure, the Voynich manuscript. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I have heard of it before and it fascinates me.
It fascinates a lot of people, including me. So the Voynich manuscript was named after, so it's called the Voynich manuscript, not after the author, but a Jesuit scholar or book collector who found it or who bought it, I think in the early 20th century. But it's actually a medieval botanical document. It's written in a cursive script on a vellum parchment, and it's filled with these extraordinary illustrations, which range from astronomical diagrams to, as I say, these sort of botanical illustrations, and then these really enigmatic scenarios with female figures who seem to be moving through these sort of vascular networks of plants, is how I read them, and moving in and out of seed pods, a little bit like Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delight has similar motifs, and that painting actually was made about 30 years after the Voynich manuscript. But the reason it's so mysterious is that the script that it's written in has never been deciphered, and many people have had a go. So, world-renowned cryptologists have tried to decipher it but failed. So we don't know who wrote it or why or what the meaning is, but I think, even without the interpretation of the text, the images speak to a lot of the ideas that we've been discussing this morning, which, relate the botanical kingdom to the astrological realm. And that idea of a kind of astrological botany was quite popular really in the medieval era, and even a bit later. The idea that there was this sort of harmony or affinity between all aspects of the living world was not far-fetched at all. And it was thought that certain plants would have their correspondences in the planet. So, Jupiter might have a relationship with dandelions, and that would influence when those plants were planted or sown, when they were harvested, how they were used in the body. So the ancient idea of humours, so there being these sort of juices or substances in the body, which then have their moods or temperaments, so sanguine or melancholy, and then those sort of principles also having their counterparts in the astrological realm. And this idea was used to then bring about harmony in the body, so sort of trying to attune what's inside with what's outside. And that's an idea which is also present in Ayurveda, which is a form of ancient medicine from India, which is much older than the European model of the humours, actually. But so the Voynich manuscript is enigmatic, to say the least, and we were really fortunate to have a facsimile version of it, very beautiful version from the Yale library from America in the exhibition. So
yeah, it is a good one, that. I defy anyone to go and try and decode it. What is the significance of Jung's archetypes in relation to botany?
Jung was really inspired by the potency of symbolic images. So, most people know Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst, a founder along with Freud of the psychoanalytic movement. And, you know, his inquiries into the working of the mind had a strong focus actually on images. So he had a process called active imagination, and he was also a practicing artist. Many people don't know that. And one of the works of his which fascinated me the most is called, now it's popularly called the Red Book, but originally it was called Liber Novus. So this is a manuscript which he created with a sort of very medieval idiom. The images that he was creating, they appear like very traditional illuminations from medieval manuscripts. But what he's exploring through those images were these archetypal forms, which either occurred in his mind or through his work with his patients. He saw these images which kept recurring again and again. And for him, these spoke directly to the structure of the collective unconscious, which for Jung is the thing which we all share in common. In a way, it's like what structures the human mind so that we can all communicate with each other the same way that our bodies have more or less the same physiological form. The mind also has these sort of primary structures, and he spoke about these as images. And one of the prevailing images was the mandala. So Jung also found inspiration in a Eastern alchemy text called The Secret of the Golden Flower, which was really a sort of instructional book about meditation and how to gain enlightenment and a form of alchemy of the mind through meditation. But the images in this book were primarily mandala forms. So for anyone that doesn't know what a mandala is, it takes many different forms, as I mentioned earlier, from, you know, stained glass windows in medieval churches to Tibetan mandalas, which are used as meditation devices. And they occur in the natural world in the form of flowers. So it's a kind of a form which opens out from a central point. So like the petals which open out in a flower. And that central point represents the center of consciousness, or the subject, who is at the center of a world which is in many ways created by the mind as it opens out, you know, to infinity, really. So this form fascinated Jung, and he drew many different mandalas in that manuscript and elsewhere, which for him was sort of schematizations of the universe. And what's interesting in the exhibition is, you know, we started to look at different artists through time who have been fascinated by this same form, the mandala. And that ranges from, you know, West Coast countercultural artists through to Hildegard of Bingen, who was a medieval mystic, an abbess in Germany, who had a communion with God and also was, you know, speaking about these extraordinary archetypal images, really. So, yeah, the mandala form, which essentially is derived from a sort of flower formation, is extremely fundamental to Jung's to a lot of Jung's work in thinking about the subject of consciousness and its place in the world. But the botanical motifs don't stop there. There are countless examples in his work, and another one is the motif of the tree. So the tree having its roots embedded into the earth, into the terrestrial realm, going down into the shadows, and then rising up through the trunk up into the celestial realm to the light. So for Jung, this symbolized the process of transformation in the individual. So going from the shadow to the light. And this also being a kind of, I mean, if you think about what plants do in transmuting solar energy into matter, they also, they're representing that axis between the realm of pure energy, or the spirit realm, and the terrestrial, everyday, the kind of mundane world that we live in. So for Jung, that motif was also extremely important in thinking about the psychological process and this kind of potential transformation in consciousness.
Thanks, Gina, for sharing some of your vast amount of knowledge on this subject. If you do have a chance, please take a bit of time out to go and really browse around the exhibition. Not only is it brilliant in itself, but I think it will spark your curiosity and lead you off down other botanically related paths. Thank you for listening, and thanks to the indefatigable, indomitable and generous Linda King for suggesting Gina. Linda, keep doing you. And please also go and check out this episode's sponsors, the Real Soil Company. They're offering 5% off all orders of its new super soil throughout May and June 2021. Simply visit the link in the show notes and enter the code ROOTSANDALL5, all uppercase, at the checkout. I'll leave you with Dr. Ian Bedford, talking about a bug that cut flower enthusiasts will know all about.
Many different insect species will have spent their winter months hibernating away as adults. Then, as soon as spring arrives, they'll waken and venture out to feed, and to lay the eggs that produce their next generation. One group of these, which often appear in large numbers, are the pollen beetles. Small, 2 mm long shiny black insects with distinctive clubbed antennae. Strongly attracted to the colour yellow, the beetles will invade flowers such as daffodils, where they crawl into the corolla and feed on the pollen within. Although pollen beetles don't cause any damage to the blooms, they're often regarded as a nuisance when they emerge from the flowers that are taken into the house. However, it's quite easy to resolve the problem by simply placing the cut flowers in a vase within a darkened room for an hour or so, close to an open window. The beetles should then crawl out of the flowers and fly away towards the light. Since pollen beetles don't harm these flowers in our gardens, it's best if we just ignore them. Besides, they're only using them as a convenient food source whilst they're searching for certain wildflowers and agricultural crops such as oilseed rape to lay their eggs on. Using a pesticide against them would certainly be the wrong thing to do, as it would harm the many other insects that visit the flowers to feed. Once a suitable host plant has been found though, the pollen beetles deposit their eggs, which then hatch after a week into little cream-coloured maggots that begin feeding on the developing flower buds. When fully grown, the larvae descend to the ground to pupate within the soil. Then during midsummer, they'll emerge as the next generation of adult pollen beetles, who will then fly off to eat pollen for the rest of the year before settling into their winter hibernation. A word of warning though, for anyone who likes wearing yellow. It might be worth wearing an alternative colour when the pollen beetles are about, or you may well experience the problem that befalls Norwich City football fans at the end and the start of the football season each year.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.